The wars between the fledgling Republic of Rome and its northern neighbor, the Etruscans, are some of the most famous and important in Rome's extremely long history of wars. The Etruscans represented the first true test for the newly established republic. If Rome were to realize its potential and establish control over Italy, then it first needed to take care of the Etruscans. But just who were these Etruscans? Why were they such an important test for the early Roman Republic? And how did they ascend to their position as the dominant power in central Italy? Let's talk about it. Before we get any further into today's episode, I just want to quickly ask that you subscribe and like if you enjoy my content. It really helps the channel out and it motivates me to make more content. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. Before we get deep into the history of the Etruscans, let's first define just what an Etruscan even was. The Etruscans were an Italic tribe that seemed to have had their homeland in what is today Tuscany. I hear you asking, what is an Italic tribe? Well, it's almost exactly what it sounds like. We use the term Italic tribe to describe the various ethnic groups living in and around Italy from roughly the Copper Age, beginning somewhere around 3700 BCE, all the way until their full assimilation into the Roman culture through a process known as Romanization in the latter half of the first millennium BCE. These groups varied wildly over different time periods, but they were all speakers of the Italic language family, the most prominent examples being Latin and by extension the Romance languages of today. There are far too many examples for us to talk about here, but just know that by the time of the Roman Republic, the main Italic tribes were the Latins, which would eventually become Roman, the Etruscans, the Umbrians, and the Samnites. Now that we've gotten a bit of the basics out of the way, let's talk about how the Etruscans in particular fit into Italian history. I should quickly note here that almost all of our information on the Etruscans come from either Roman or Greek writers, or from our own archaeological reconstructions. Almost all surviving Etruscan writing is solely based on their religion, and not on their culture or history. I just want to note that before we move forward. So, in saying that, there are three main historical theories for how the Etruscans first got their start, so to speak, in Italy. The first is that they developed in their home region, called Etruria, modern-day Tuscany, out of a much older culture. That culture is called the Villanovan Culture, and we will talk about them in just a moment, so let's stick a pin in this theory for just a second. The second theory is that the Etruscans are actually the descendants of Greek immigrants. This theory was heavily pushed by several Greek writers, including Herodotus. Depending on who you choose to believe, the Etruscans could be from Lydia in modern-day Anatolia, or from Thessaly, or even descendants of the peoples who lived in Greece prior to the arrival of the modern-day Greek. In any case, this theory falls pretty flat upon closer inspection. Firstly, if we look at earlier Greek writings, say Theogony by Hesiod, or the Homeric hymn to Dionysus, we actually do find mention of the Etruscans, though they are typically referred to as the Tyrrhenians. In these works, neither author makes any mention of any sort of migration that resulted in the creation of the Etruscan culture or state. Instead, both seem to believe that the Etruscans had been in Etruria for as long as the Greeks had been in Greece. Secondly, when we look at the archaeological record, we find no linking artifacts, writings, or anything else that would indicate a mass migration from Greece into Etruria. Because of these two factors, this theory is typically rejected by most modern historians and experts. The third theory was promulgated by everyone's favorite Roman historian, Livy, along with Pliny the Elder. In this theory, the Etruscans are actually related, or maybe even descended from the Rhaetian people. The Rhaetian people are a fascinating subject on their own, but I won't get too deep into their history for this video. They lived in the Alps, in modern-day Tyrol in Austria, and portions of Switzerland. They actually spoke a language that is seemingly related to the Etruscan language, which is itself a language seemingly unrelated to any other. Now wait just a second. Didn't I say just a little bit ago that the Italic tribes spoke languages in the Italic language family? Well, yes I did. The Etruscans, though, are a special case. Their language is almost completely unique, and it is even a pre-Indo-European language. While I won't go too deep into what exactly that means, let's just say that it means that the language was completely unrelated to, say, something like Latin. In fact, it is seemingly only related to the Rhaetian language and a small language in the Aegean Sea known as Laminian. Okay, so now we have three languages. One spoken by the Etruscans within Etruria, one spoken by the Rhaetians in the Alps, and one spoken in the Aegean by the Laminians. So what gives? Could the Greek migration theory actually be right? And did the Etruscans actually descend from the Rhaetians? Well, probably not on both counts. From modern DNA studies, we find that the Etruscans are actually extremely genetically similar to the Latins and other Italic groups. It's also found that the Etruscans were completely missing signals in their DNA that would come from Anatolian or Iranian ancestry. This is important because we find those signals in groups that are descended from Indo-European groups, such as the Greeks and the Latins. If you want more information on this, then definitely leave a comment and I'll do a video digging a little deeper into the spread of Indo-European languages and cultures. This DNA evidence points towards the Etruscans being autochthonous, a fancy word for being indigenous. So then how do we explain the widespread distribution of these related language families? Well, it seems as though these three languages were actually holdouts from a much earlier period of European history. These languages likely developed during the early European Neolithic Revolution, along with languages like Basque, Minoan, and others. These languages would, save for Basque, fall into disuse and eventually disappear as the Indo-Europeans began their massive migration into the continent. So, to sum most of this up, the Etruscans were almost certainly autochthonous to Etruria. They spoke a pre-Indo-European language that was related to two other pre-Indo-European languages spoken by other groups. Now, let's get into some actual Etruscan history. The absolute earliest evidence we have of a distinctly Etruscan culture is from roughly 900 BCE. We actually call this early Etruscan culture the Villanovan Culture. I told you we would talk about them. Now, to be 100% clear, the Villanovan culture and the Etruscan culture consist of the same people. It's just a term of convenience used by historians to describe the Etruscan culture in its earliest developmental period. So from now on, just remember that if I say Villanovan, I really mean Etruscan. This Villanovan culture had been developing since the Bronze Age, and by 900 BCE had just entered the Iron Age. It was this early Villanovan culture that would first establish settlements in places that would eventually become popular and important Etruscan cities. These included places like Veii and Tarquinia. This culture created beautiful works of bronze and pottery. While I'm showing you an example or two here, I really encourage you to go look up some of these works of art. I think they are just absolutely incredible. We don't know a whole lot about the government or anything like that of these peoples. Instead, we mostly only know of these peoples through what has survived in the archaeological record. I've already mentioned the art and the pottery, but we also know that this culture created large wattle and daub and sun-dried mud brick houses. We've found a few examples, from small huts that would only really support one single family, all the way to relatively massive huts that would have been able to house 10 or more people at one time. Interestingly, we see evidence that some deceased members of the family would be cremated and interred in urns, made into the shape of the individual houses. These urns would then be kept inside the home. The Villanovans also seem to have believed in some sort of afterlife, as each burial has been found to contain everyday items and tools such as knives, other weapons, and even weaving tools. The Villanovan culture would begin to undergo a period of massive cultural change in roughly 720 BCE. This period, known as the Orientalizing Period, would really mark the change from Villanovan into what we think of today as Etruscan. What brought this on, you may ask? Well, it's everyone's favorite colonizers of antiquity, the Greeks. This period of change would last until roughly 580 BCE. By this point, the Etruscan culture had changed dramatically. The Etruscans by this point seem to have been politically similar to the Greeks. Their domains consisted of independent city-states united by their common language, culture, and religion. This is, of course, extremely similar to what Greece looked like in the same period, and it really makes a lot of sense when you consider the changes that the Greeks had brought onto the Etruscan culture. Etruria was also a very rich region. The land was fertile and could support large populations with next to no risk of famine, while the hills were filled with precious metals, including iron, copper, and even some gold and silver. This allowed the Etruscans to conduct a massive amount of trade, as everyone, from the Greeks to the Carthaginians, needed iron, and the Etruscans just happened to have a lot of it. From the end of the Orientalizing period, roughly 580 BCE, all the way until the 380s BCE, the Etruscans were one of, if not the dominant naval power of the Western Mediterranean. They were so dominant that the Greeks nearly universally referred to them as scoundrel pirates. It was only the rise of the massively powerful Greek city-state of Syracuse in the 4th and 3rd century BCE that would eventually force the Etruscans to limit themselves to the Tyrrhenian Sea. Inland, the Etruscans also copied the Greeks, with Corinthian helmets, bronze breastplates, large circular shields, long spears, and a phalanx formation. The Etruscan army would have looked almost exactly like a Greek one. But by the 6th century BCE, we begin to see some smaller, rounder helmets. This would point towards a more mobile version of warfare. We also begin to see the minting of coinage around the same time. This points towards the use of foreign mercenaries, something that was extremely common in the Mediterranean at the time. By this point, the Etruscans had expanded into the northern Po Valley and south into the Campania region. They looked a little something like this. We sadly know next to nothing about most of the wars and conflicts fought with the other native peoples of the region, so I can't regale you with stories of Etruscan heroism, but I'm sure there were great and massive battles. Remember though, this was not one united polity. Instead, this was a collection of independent city-states, or sometimes slightly larger confederations, that were only united by their culture, religion, and language. This decentralized type of government would actually eventually prove to be their downfall. Now, at this point, Rome and the Etruscans would begin to clash, and we will talk about that in our next video. However, we still have a couple of things to quickly discuss. The first is that of Etruscan government. We've already talked a little bit about the Etruscan city-states, but that still leaves quite a few questions up in the air. Were these democracies or monarchies? Did they ever unite into larger federations? Well, it seems as though the earlier versions of the city-states were almost certainly monarchies. However, as the Etruscans expanded and trade flourished, we see the development of a wealthy and politically important upper class. This quickly led to most Etruscan cities becoming oligarchies. In terms of larger federations, we only really know of one such thing. That was the annual meeting of the Etruscan League. We know next to nothing about the details of this annual meeting or even the league in general. We are told by Livy that this was an alliance of 12 of the most important Etruscan cities that loosely operated as a single political unit. I say loosely here as it seems that each city was mostly given free rein to do what it wanted to. Apparently, each year elders from the cities would meet at the Fanium Volturnae, the chief religious sanctuary of the Etruscans. Here they would discuss military campaigns and civil affairs and pray to their common gods, along with electing a single leader who represented the league as a whole. It's unclear just what sort of powers this leader actually held. We are also told that the cities of Campania and the Po Valley had their own versions of this league, but it's unclear how widespread or influential these were. Etruscan society was very stratified, with levels ranging from slaves and foreigners all the way to the ruling class. A person's membership in certain clans seems to have been the deciding factor as to where on the social ladder they belonged. Women also seem to have had more rights in Etruscan culture than most other contemporary cultures. They were allowed to inherit property and may have even been in charge of the family while they were in the home. Men still dominated public life, however. But we need only remember women like Tanaquil, wife to Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the 5th king of Rome, to see that women still held some sway over public life. This was a very, and I mean very, brief overview of the Etruscans before their conflicts with Rome. At this point, they were masters of northern Italy. Their navies, while diminished, were still powerful enough to rule over the Tyrrhenian Sea, and their armies had established dominance over the Po Valley and most of Campania. However, they were about to face their toughest challenge yet, the Roman Republic. And spoiler alert, they would not be able to overcome such a challenge. But how did they fall? How did Rome overcome such a seemingly powerful state? And why are the Etruscans remembered even after their eventual defeat? Join me next time when we discuss all of this and more. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something. I'm sorry if this video seemed a bit light on the details, but we really are just missing so much information about the early Etruscan culture. Basically, all we have to go on are the writings of Livy and other Roman historians who were all much more interested in talking about Rome and its conquest of the Etruscans rather than Etruscan history. I hope this all makes sense though, and gave a decent overview of how the Etruscans came to dominate northern Italy. Also, I'm sure you all noticed that I conveniently avoided talking about Etruscan religion. That is because there will be a new series coming out on the channel looking at individual mythologies that I think are seriously overlooked. And the first mythology we will be looking at is that of the Etruscans. So if you're interested in that, be on the lookout for the first video of that series this Friday, July 14th. If you have any comments or questions on the video or believe I made a mistake, please comment down below, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. It really helps the channel out. Peace.